The Roman Empire is often remembered for its shining giants names like Augustus, Nero, and Constantine echo through history books and documentaries. But the empire wasn't just shaped by the big, dramatic figures. It was also carved by rulers who flickered briefly, almost forgotten. These emperors, often erased by chaos, betrayal, or bad luck, show us a Rome that was fragile as much as it was powerful. They were men who wore the purple but never got the glory. Leaders whose time on the throne was so short or so troubled that historians tend to pass them by with a shrug. And yet, when you pause and look closer, their reigns tell us just as much about Rome as the long, famous dynasties. They remind us that empires aren't only built on grand victories or monumental reforms, but also on fragile moments where survival was the real victory. Forgotten emperors exposed the cracks in Rome as a marble facade, revealing a constant battle against corruption, rebellion, and the raw unpredictability of power. Without them, we'd have a polished version of history. But we see Rome for what it truly was: magnificent, unstable, and human at its core. Take, for example, Emperor. His story feels almost like a cruel joke written by fate. A respected senator and military man, Pertinax was chosen to restore order after Commodus's bizarre and chaotic rule ended in blood. For a brief moment, people hoped Rome could breathe again. Pertinax was disciplined, serious, and determined to clean up the corruption that had poisoned the empire. But that very discipline angered the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's supposed protectors, who had grown fat on bribes and privileges. But Pertinax tried to rein them in, reminding them that Rome wasn't their personal bank. Within 87 days, less than a single season, his reign was cut short by the swords of his own guards. Pertinax's name became a whisper, but his death was a scream. It told Romans that power no longer came from the Senate, or people, even divine favor. It came from soldiers with sharp blades and empty purses, ready to sell or slay emperors for their own gain. Now consider Didius Julianus, the man who literally bought the empire at auction. After Pertinax's assassination, the Praetorian Guard decided Rome's throne was just another prize to be sold to the highest bidder. In a grotesque scene, senators and nobles competed with bags of gold, while armed soldiers cheered on the bidding war. Julianus won, offering a fortune for the chance to rule. But an empire bought like cattle comes with no loyalty. The people despised him, the Senate tolerated him, and the provinces mocked him. He tried to act the part of an emperor, but every decree he made dripped with desperation. His reign lasted just 66 days before Septimius Severus, marching from the provinces with his legions, declared him a fraud and had him executed. Julianus is often remembered with contempt, but his story reveals the sheer rot at the empire's core. When the throne itself could be sold like property, Rome's glory was little more than a mask stretched over greed. Another shattered figure is Emperor Gordian I, an elderly senator pushed into the purple during a chaotic revolt in North Africa. Gordian was 80 years old, ancient by Roman standards, and never truly wanted to rule. His elevation was born not of ambition, but of local elites, desperate to replace a hated governor loyal to the Emperor Maximinus Drax. Gordian, with a son as co-emperor, suddenly found himself at the center of a rebellion. For a short few weeks, hope soared. Romans, weary of Maximinus's brutality, dreamed of new leadership, even if Gordian seemed fragile. But the dream collapsed almost instantly. His son was killed in battle. Gordian, grief-stricken, took his own life, and the rebellion crumbled. His reign lasted only 21 days, shorter than some modern vacations. Still, his tragic rise and fall show how desperation could create emperors overnight, and how fragile that crown truly was. Gordian I wasn't remembered for triumphs, but for how brutally the empire chewed him up. Another reminder of the dangers of power seized in panic. Then there's Gordian II, his son, whose story is tied inseparably to his father's fate. Younger and more energetic, Gordian II was meant to provide the military backbone to the family's sudden throne, but he was thrown into battle against the loyalist army with little preparation, and the odds were stacked. In the clash, Gordian II was cut down, and with him died the brief hope of the Gordian dynasty. His death triggered his father's despair, sealing both their fates. Gordian I's name rarely echoes in classrooms, overshadowed by Rome's titans, yet his short, bloody story is a clear example of how emperorship in Rome could be as much a death sentence as a prize. His tragedy is almost cinematic. A son fighting for a cause larger than himself, only to fall and pull down his grieving father with him. In that loss, we glimpse the cruelty of Roman politics and empire, that demanded loyalty but rewarded ambition with graves. Maximinus Thrax, the man whose cruelty sparked the Gordians' rebellion, also sits in the gallery of forgotten imp, a soldier of barbarian birth, who rose through sheer physical strength and discipline. Maximinus was a giant in stature and in brutality. He taxed the empire ruthlessly, stripped cities of wealth, and treated senators with disdain, preferring the loyalty of his legions. His reign was marked by constant paranoia and bloodshed, yet he lacked the refinement of Rome's traditional rulers. The Senate loathed him, the people feared him, and even his soldiers began to doubt him. Eventually, his own army turned against him while he was besieging Aquileia. Maximinus was killed by his troops, his head sent to Rome as proof. His reign shows the empire's fragility. In times of chaos, sheer muscle could win the throne, but muscle alone couldn't hold it. Maximinus was a blunt instrument, a reminder that Rome's emperors could sometimes resemble warlords more than statesmen. Another almost forgotten emperor is Pappinus, chosen by the Senate in a desperate attempt to stabilize the empire after the Gordians' collapse. Pappinus was older, stern, and carried himself like a military commander. He was paired with Balbinus as co-emperor, a compromise meant to unite Senate and people. But compromises in Rome often crumbled under their own weight. The two men bickered, their authority was questioned, and the Praetorian Guard, two kingmakers remained. Restless, Pappinus might have had the will to lead, but in the poisonous atmosphere of distrust, he never got the chance. Wheaton, aye. Both he and Balbinus were dragged from the palace and slaughtered by their own guards. Pappinus serves as a grim reminder that in Rome, the emperor was often the least secure man in the empire. Titles and purple robes couldn't protect you from the blades of the very men sworn to defend you. Balbinus, the partner in this ill-fated co-rulership, fared no better. Where Pappinus was strict and militaristic, Balbinus was more refined and senatorial, a man of culture rather than command. Their pairing was supposed to balance strengths, but instead, it highlighted weaknesses. Balbinus lacked the respect of the army, and Pappinus lacked the charm to win the people. Together, they ruled in name, but in practice, their authority was when the Praetorian Guard decided they were liabilities. Both were cut down without ceremony. Balbinus's reign was so short and so overshadowed by failure that his name nearly vanished from the empire's memory. Yet his story illustrates an important truth. Rome's emperors weren't always chosen for greatness. Sometimes, they were chosen for expedience. And expedience was rarely enough to survive. Next is Philip the Aram, a man who rose from provincial obscurity to Rome's highest office. Unlike the brief emperors before him, Philip ruled for several years and is best remembered for presiding over Rome's 1000th anniversary celebrations. Yet even he is often overlooked, sandwiched between the chaos of earlier years and the crises that followed. Philip tried to balance diplomacy with military campaigns, but his provincial origins made him suspect in the eyes of Rome's elite. His reign ended violently, as so many did when his rival Decius marched against him. Defeated in battle, Philip was killed, and his son murdered shortly after. Despite his longer rule, Philip remains half forgotten, his achievements drowned out by Rome's constant drumbeat of civil wars. His legacy lingers as a reminder that even emperors who managed to celebrate Rome's grandeur could still vanish quickly into obscurity. Decius, the man who overthrew Philip, became emperor in one of Rome's darkest chapters. A career soldier loyal to tradition, Decius sought to restore the old Roman values by reviving harsh persecutions of Christians and enforcing strict discipline. For a time, his policies gave the impression of control, but beneath the surface, the empire continued to fracture. His fate was sealed on the battlefield against invading Goths, where he became the first Roman emperor to die in combat against a foreign enemy. His death shocked the emperors were supposed to be untouchable, chosen by the gods, not corpses on muddy battlefields. Decius's brief rule, marked by severity and failure, exposed just how vulnerable Rome had become. His story shows that even the strongest convictions couldn't hold back the tides of change sweeping through the empire. Trebonian Ascalas stepped into power during one of Rome's ugliest moments, the plague that ravaged the empire. His reign was defined less by strategy and more by desperation. The plague thinned legions, shattered families, and drained morale. Gallus tried to buy peace with invaders by paying them off, a decision that made him look weak at home while temporarily calming the frontier. He struggled against problems too vast for one man to solve. When rival forces rose, his already shaken position crumbled, eventually betrayed by his own troops. Gallus was killed alongside his son. His name slipped into near obscurity, overshadowed by the chaos that swallowed his empire. Gallus's tragedy was that he inherited disaster, not power, and became a symbol of survival attempts that failed. His rule reminds us that sometimes emperors didn't fall because they were incompetent, but because the storms they faced were far stronger than any man could endure. Aemilian, who briefly seized the throne after Gallus's fall, ruled for just 3 months. He gained fame as a general for defeating Goths and was hailed by soldiers hungry for victory. His rise was rapid, but Rome's politics rarely rewarded speed with stability. As he marched toward Rome, another rival, Valerian, advanced with his own army. Aemilian's soldiers, sensing the winds of fortune shifting, murdered him before battle could even decide his fate. His reign was so brief that many Romans barely knew his name before he was gone. Yet his story shows the brutal reality of the 3rd century crisis. Loyalty was fluid, and emperors could be discarded as easily as coins. Aemilian's legacy is a blur, but his swift rise and fall highlight how fragile the imperial crown had become, more a gamble than a guarantee of glory. Valerian, the man who replaced Aemilian, left a legacy defined by humiliation. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor was captured alive by a foreign enemy, taken by the Persians during battle. Valerian spent the rest of his life in captivity, allegedly used as a human footstool for the Persian king. Whether or not that story is exaggerated, his fate shocked the empire. Rome's supreme leader once thought Semidavino was paraded as a trophy. It was a catastrophic blow to Roman prestige, and Valerian's legacy became a symbol of decline. Yet, in the midst of disaster, his son Gallienus rose to the occasion, showing that even humiliations could forge resilience. Valerian's capture remains one of the darkest stains in Imperium history, a moment when the Eternal Empire looked alarmingly mortal. His reign is mostly forgotten because of its shame, but the lesson it teaches is unforgettable. Power can vanish in a single defeat. Gallienus, son of Valerian, has long been underrated by historians. While his father languished in captivity, Gallienus took control of a collapsing empire. His reign was marked by constant invasions, usurpers, and rebellions. Yet, unlike many emperors, he adapted. He reformed the military by relying on cavalry units, a decision that influenced Rome's armies for centuries. He also promoted merit over aristocracy, allowing men of talent to rise. Despite his innovations, his reputation suffered because he couldn't stop the tide of chaos. Critics remembered his defeats, not his resilience. Eventually, betrayed by generals, Gallienus was assassinated. Forgotten by many, his true story is that of survival against impossible odds. Gallienus kept the empire afloat during storms that might have sunk it earlier. And for that, he deserves more than a footnote. In many ways, he was the emperor who kept Rome breathing long enough for future recovery. Claudius Tiguthicus emerged from the wreckage Gallienus left behind, remembered mostly for a single victory at the Battle of Nessus. He crushed a massive Gothic invasion, a triumph so decisive it earned him lasting praise. He was hailed as a hero, yet his reign lasted barely 2 years before disease claimed him. Claudius became one of the rare emperors, celebrated both by contemporaries and later rulers, even earning posthumous honors from Constantine. Still, his name is often overshadowed by longer-reigning emperors, his brief spark fading against Rome's grander narratives. Claudius proves that sometimes all it took was one moment of brilliance to leave a legacy. Though forgotten by the masses, his story shows how victory, however short-lived, could carve a place in Rome's memory. Claudius II reminds us that emperors didn't need decades to matter. Sometimes, a single battle was enough. Quintilis, Claudius II's brother, ruled for only a few weeks after his sibling's death. Elevated quickly by the Senate, he faced immediate opposition from Aurelian, a general backed by the legions. Recognizing the impossible odds, Quintillus either took his own life or was murdered, depending on the account. His reign was so short it barely left a trace, a flicker in the storm of the 3rd century crisis. Yet even this fleeting episode reveals how fragile imperial power had become. Emperors were no longer chosen by destiny but by the sword, and survival depended less on competence than on military loyalty. Quintillus's story is easy to skip, but it reminds us how thin the line between emperor and corpse really was. Rome's throne, once seen as sacred, had become a revolving door of desperation. Quintillus entered quickly and exited just as fast. Aurelian is one of those emperors who should be remembered as a giant, but often slips under the radar. Rising from humble origins, he reunited a fractured empire, defeating breakaway states in the East and West. Known as restorer of the world, he restored Roman authority in ways few thought possible. Yet his reign was cut short by assassination, orchestrated by officers misled into believing he planned their deaths. Aurelian's vision was broad, his victories immense, but his memory remained strangely muted, perhaps because he lacked dynastic heirs, or because his reign ended abruptly. History gave him less spotlight than he deserved. Aurelian's story is proof that even great achievements can fade without the weight of legend to preserve them. Forgotten emperors aren't always the weak ones sometimes. They're the strong who never got enough time. Tacitus, not the historian but the emperor, came to power in the twilight of the crisis. He, elected by the Senate in old age, he was seen as a compromise candidate, someone who could calm Rome's chaos with wisdom. His reign was brief, lasting only months before illness or assassination claimed him. Tacitus's legacy is so faint that even ancient writers barely bothered to record it. He stands as a symbol of Rome's exhaustion during this era. Emperors came and went so fast that their names blurred together. His forgotten status isn't about incompetence, but about timing. Tacitus ruled at a moment when stability was impossible, and his fleeting presence left no lasting mark. Yet even in his obscurity, he reveals the truth about Rome's endless cycle. The throne itself became a burden no one could truly bear for long. Florian, who followed Tacitus, barely ruled for a season. His attempt to hold power collapsed when his troops defected to his rival, killed by his own men. Florian's reign was erased almost as quickly as it began. He is often reduced to a single line in history: ruled for a few months, then slain. Yet that line speaks volumes about the empire's instability. Florian wasn't unique. He was part of a long parade of emperors chewed up by Rome's crisis. Forgotten by most, his name survives only as another reminder of how fragile the purple was. The imperial throne had become less a seat of power and more a death sentence waiting to be signed. His memory may be faint, but his story is woven into the broader tapestry of Rome's decline. Then came Probus, one of the rare forgotten emperors who actually thrived. A skilled general, Probus secured victories on multiple fronts, restoring order in provinces scarred by years of chaos. He even promoted economic recovery, famously employing soldiers in peacetime to plant vineyards and rebuild infrastructure. But like so many emperors, his reforms angered those closest to him. Soldiers, resentful of the busy work he imposed, turned on him and killed him. Probus's story is bittersweet. A capable, reform-minded ruler, undone by the very army that owed him stability. His achievements deserved a lasting spotlight, but history dimmed him, leaving only a faint echo of his successes. Forgotten emperors like Probus remind us that greatness wasn't always rewarded with gratitude, was often repaid with betrayal. Rome's empire survived because of men like him, yet rarely did it remember them. Carus stepped onto the stage during one of Rome's recurring crises, inheriting the chaos of endless wars. Unlike many of his predecessors, he managed to achieve swift victories against Persia, regaining some lost prestige for the empire. His soldiers respected him, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Rome had found a leader who could steady the ship. But his reign was cut short under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed he was killed by a lightning strike. Others whispered about assassination. Whatever the truth, his sudden death threw the empire back into turmoil. Carus had the makings of a stabilizer, but fate denied him time. His memory fades in comparison to legendary rulers. Yet his brief success reminds us that Rome still had sparks of greatness, even in its darkest century. Forgotten, yes, but not without significance. Carinus, son of Carus, gained power at a time when Rome desperately needed continuity. Instead, he developed a reputation for excess and indulgence. More interested in luxury than leadership, ancient sources painted him as corrupt and immoral, but historians debate whether these accounts were exaggerated by his enemies. Despite his flaws, Carinus managed to secure victories in battle, proving he wasn't entirely incompetent. His downfall came not from foreign enemies, but betrayal within his own ranks. At a decisive moment, his officers killed him, clearing the way for Diocletian's rise. Carinus is often remembered as a disgrace, but his story also shows the brutal politics of succession, whether truly corrupt or simply unlucky. His reign is a reminder of how reputation could doom an emperor as much as defeat on the battlefield. Diocletian is far from forgotten by scholars, but the average person rarely knows his story. Yet, he was one of the most transformative emperors in Roman history. Coming from humble origins, Diocletian rose to power and completely restructured the empire. He divided authority under the system known as the Tetrarchy, ensuring multiple rulers could manage different regions at once. His reforms stabilized an empire on the brink of collapse, setting the stage for centuries of survival. Yet his legacy is overshadowed by Constantine, who followed him and embraced Christianity. Diocletian, who retired to grow cabbages in his palace in Dalmatia, deserves more recognition. His choice to step down voluntarily was almost unheard of in Roman politics. Tug Aes and T. Entirely forgotten. He's rarely celebrated outside academic circles. Diocletian proves that stability could be built, not just through conquest, but through vision and discipline. Maximian, Diocletian's partner in the Tetrarchy, played a crucial role in holding the empire together. Tasked with defending the western half, he was a soldier emperor through and through. His reign was marked by constant military campaigns, pushing back Germanic invasions and defending Rome's frontiers. Yet Maximian lived in the shadow of Diocletian, his achievements often overlooked. When Diocletian retired, Maximian reluctantly stepped down but later tried to reclaim power. His repeated comebacks ended badly, with betrayal, humiliation, and ultimately forced suicide. Maximian's story is one of loyalty, ambition, and downfall. Though he was central to Rome's survival during his time, history tends to reduce him to Diocletian's sidekick. Forgotten emperors like Maximian showed that even those who carried the empire on their shoulders could slip into the margins of memory. His life was proof that power was addictive, and once tasted, impossible to let go. Galerius, another member of the Tetrarchy, rose from peasant origins to command the eastern province. Fierce and ambitious, he won important victories against Persia, restoring Roman confidence in the east. But Galerius was also known for his brutality and heavy taxation, which fueled resentment among the people. His role in initiating harsh persecutions of Christians stained his reputation for centuries, overshadowing his military accomplishments. Galerius tried to continue Diocletian's system, but internal rivalries fractured the Tetrarchy after Diocletian's retirement. Illness eventually consumed him, and his reign ended in misery. Galerius is rarely remembered today, lost in the shuffle of emperors who fought for survival during Rome a Salateon Pia. Yet his life illustrates the paradox of power. Victories can be undone by cruelty, and legacies shaped as much by failure as success. Galerius should be remembered not only as a warrior, but also as a warning about the cost of unchecked ambition. Constantius Glorious, father of Constantine the Great, is remembered mostly because of his son, but his own career deserves more credit. Serving as Caesar under the Tetrarchy, he ruled the western provinces with competence and pragmatism. He defeated enemies in Britain and Gaul, restoring stability in regions that had seen chaos for decades. Constantius's reign was relatively short, and his natural death for an emperor of the team allowed Constantine to ascend. Yet his legacy is often overshadowed by the towering fame of his son, who reshaped the empire forever. Constantius himself was a skilled administrator and commander, a man who kept the West steady during turbulent years. Forgotten in the shadow of greatness, he deserves recognition as more than just the father of Constantine. He was the bridge between Rome's crisis and its Christian transformation, even if history rarely gives him the spotlight. Severus II, appointed by Galerius after the retirement of Diocletian and Maximian, quickly found himself in a no-win situation. As Augustus in the West, he faced rebellion from Maxentius in Rome. Marching to suppress the uprising, Severus was abandoned by his own troops, many of whom had served under Maximian and remained loyal to him. Captured by his enemies, Severus was humiliated and later executed. His reign was short and disastrous, leaving little to admire, yet his story reflects the unstable nature of the tetrarchy once Diocletian stepped away. Without a strong guiding hand, the system fractured into chaos, and emperors like Severus became casualties of the political game, forgotten not because of failure alone, but because of circumstances that made success nearly impossible. Severus II remains an example of how fragile Roman authority could be. His reign was less about ruling and more about surviving, which he could not achieve. Maxentius, the rival who overthrew Severus II, ruled Rome as emperor for 6 years. He is often remembered as the tyrant, defeated by Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. But his rule was more complex. Maxentius stabilized the city of Rome, investing in massive building projects like the Basilica of Maxentius, which still stands today. He also strengthened defenses and restored Rome's importance as the empire's symbolic heart. Yet his reliance on the Praetorian Guard and his inability to expand power beyond Italy weakened his position. Constantine's rise eventually sealed his fate, and his dramatic death in the Tiber River became legend. Forgotten as little more than Constantine's opponent, Maxentius deserves more credit as a builder and restorer of Rome's grandeur. His rule shows that even losers in history sometimes left behind monuments that outlived their reputations. Licinius, another rival of Constantine, once shared the empire in uneasy partnership with him. Initially allies, they worked together to defeat Maxentius and stabilize the empire. But as Constantine's ambition grew, the partnership soured. Licinius ruled the eastern provinces and introduced reforms, even issuing his own edicts of tolerance toward Christians before turning hostile later. His reign ended in defeat at Constantine's hands, and he was executed. Despite promises of clemency, Licinius's legacy is overshadowed by Constantine's rise, remembered mainly as the man who stood in the way of destiny. Yet his role was pivotal in shaping the empire during one of its most transformative eras. Forgotten because history tends to favor winners, Licinius reminds us that power struggles often erase half the story. Without him, Constantine's triumph would not have carried the same weight. Finally, we arrive at Julian, often called the apostate, one of the most fascinating forgotten. He tried to turn back Constantine's Christian revolution, reviving traditional Roman religion and philosophy. A skilled general, Julian won victories in Gaul and was beloved by his soldiers for sharing their hardships. His vision was to restore Rome's pagan traditions, blending philosophy with politics in ways few emperors dared. But his reign was short-lived during a campaign against Persia. He left his dream unfulfilled. To Christians, he became a villain. But to others, was a philosopher king who sought to give Rome a new identity. Forgotten in popular culture, Julian's reign shows the deep cultural crossroads Rome faced. He was one of the last emperors to embody both the warrior and thinker. And though his vision failed, it remains one of history's great what-ifs. Valens, often remembered only as the emperor who lost disastrously at Adrianople in 378 CE, deserves more than a footnote. He faced one of the toughest challenges in Roman history: the migration of the Goths into imperial territory. Overwhelmed by logistics, corruption, and his own hesitation, Valens marched into battle without waiting for reinforcements. The result was catastrophic. The Roman army was crushed, and Valens himself vanished in the chaos, never found. His failure marked a turning point, exposing the empire's vulnerability to barbarian groups. But beyond the disaster, Valens represents the difficulty of ruling an overstretched empire. Forgotten for his flaws, his story warns us that even emperors couldn't control forces larger than themselves. Gratian, the teenage emperor who inherited the West after Valens, tried to lead with honor. He removed pagan symbols from state rituals and supported Christianity, aligning with the shifting culture of Rome. Yet ruling as a young man in a fractured empire was nearly impossible. Betrayed by generals and abandoned by troops, Gratian was assassinated while fleeing for safety. His reign, often dismissed as weak, actually shows the dangers of youthful inexperience, combined with the weight of impossible expectations. Forgotten because of his short rule, Gratian highlights the brutal reality that Rome devoured its young leaders. Honorius is remembered mostly for one infamous fact. Rome was sacked by Alaric's Visigoths during his reign. While historians argued that he wasn't personally responsible for the disaster, his reign symbolized the empire's weakness in the west. Honorius spent much of his time in Ravenna, sheltered and distant from the realities of war. Ancient writers mocked him as cowardly, even telling the apocryphal tale that he thought Rome's fall meant his pet chicken, also named Roma, had died, though exaggerated. These stories cemented his reputation as a passive ruler. Honorius's reign shows how far the Western Empire had fallen emperors now survived in fortresses, while their capital burned. Forgotten as a little more than a joke, Honorius embodies Rome's slow collapse. Valentinian III reigned during one of the most unstable times in Western history. Rising to the throne as a child, his rule was dominated by powerful generals and court intrigue. His reign saw the empire shrink further. As Attila the Hun invaded and Vandals plundered North Africa, Valentinian himself assassinated one of his most capable generals, Idius, only to be murdered shortly after by his own bodyguards. His reign is often described as tragic incompetence, but in reality, he was a pawn in forces far larger than he could manage, forgotten because he failed to hold Rome together. Valentinian's life demonstrates how emperors became spectators to the empire's decline. Petronius Maximus lasted only 75 days as emperor, one of the shortest reigns in Roman history. He came to power through manipulation and murder, orchestrating the assassination of Valentinian III. But his grasp on power was shaky from the start. When the Vandals approached Rome, panic spread through the city. Petronius tried to flee, but the people turned on him, killing him in the streets. His reign ended in chaos, and the Vandals entered Rome soon after, plundering the city. Petronius is often a footnote, forgotten because of his brief and disastrous rule. Yet his story reveals the desperation of Rome's final days, where ambition often ended in blood on the cobblestones. Avitus, a Gallic aristocrat, elevated to emperor with the support of barbarian allies, ruled during the twilight of the Western Empire. He was unpopular in Italy, viewed as a foreign puppet, and his reliance on Visigothic support deepened resentment. When famine struck, the Senate and army turned against him. Forced to abdicate, Avitus returned to Gaul, only to die shortly after under unclear circumstances. His reign was brief, unpopular, and forgotten, yet his story reflects Rome's transformation. Emperors now relied on barbarian support to even claim the throne. Avitus embodies the shift from Roman to post-Roman Europe. Standing at the edge of history's transition, Majorian stands out as one of the last Western emperors who tried to restore Rome's greatness. A capable general, he fought bravely against barbarian groups and initiated reforms to strengthen the state, but his efforts clashed with entrenched elites and powerful allies. Betrayed by his supposed supporter Rismer, Majorian was arrested and executed after only 4 years. His reign, though short, offered a glimpse of what might have been a final spark of competence before the empire's collapse. Forgotten outside specialist circles, Majorian's tragedy is that he tried to save Rome when it was already too late. Libius Severus followed Majorian, but was little more than a puppet of Rismer, the real power in the West. His reign had no significant reforms, no victories, and no stability. Severus is often skipped over entirely in history books, a placeholder emperor whose only purpose was to give Rismer legitimacy. His forgotten reign shows how hollow the Western Empire had become. Emperors wore the purple robe, but warlords held the swords. Severus didn't leave monuments or battles to remember. Instead, he left silence, the clearest proof that Rome's imperial system was crumbling from the inside out. Anthemius, a Greek-speaking noble from the east, was installed as Western emperor with Eastern support. He was intelligent and ambitious, trying to unite the fractured West. He even launched campaigns against the Vandals, though with little success. Anthemius's downfall came through conflict with Ricimer, his powerful general. When their relationship broke down, civil war erupted in Rome itself. Anthemius was defeated and executed, another emperor swallowed by internal conflict. Forgotten today, his reign reminds us that even in its dying days, Rome still attempted comebacks, but internal betrayal was always deadlier than external enemies. Olybrius, one of the final Western emperors, barely ruled long enough to leave a mark. elevated during another civil war. He reigned for less than a year before dying. Likely of natural causes, Olybrius is the definition of a forgotten emperor. His name is buried in lists. His reign, little more than a footnote, yet he symbolizes the futility of Rome's final century, where emperors came and went like flickering candles. Olybrius didn't change history, but his existence shows us just how fragile the title of emperor had become. The man who once commanded legions across continents, now barely held a city before vanishing into obscurity. Glycerius, a little-known Western emperor, came to power in 473 CE. During the empire's last gasp, his reign lasted just over a year. But in that time, he tried to fend off barbarian invasions and stabilize a crumbling system. Unlike some of his predecessors, he didn't die violently. Instead, he was forced into retirement and made Bishop of Salona in Dalmatia. It's rare to see an emperor survive political downfall with a second career. But that's exactly what Glycerius did. His reign shows how the title of emperor had lost its grandeur. It was now a temporary role. Stripped of the glory that once defined Rome, Julius Nepos, often called the last legitimate Western emperor, reigned briefly before being ousted by his general Orestes, retreating to Dalmatia. He continued to claim the imperial title until his assassination years later. Technically, Nepos has outlasted Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor often remembered as the last, forgotten because his rule was in exile. Nepos represents the shadowy twilight of Roman power. He was emperor without an empire, a ghost clinging to faded authority. His story asks a haunting question. When does an empire truly die? When its throne is empty, or when no one believes in it anymore? Romulus Augustulus has the tragic fame of being remembered as the last emperor of the West. Yet he was only a teenager, placed on the throne by his father Orestes when the Germanic leader Odoacer seized power in 476 CE. Romulus was spared and allowed to live in retirement. Unlike the bloody ends of so many emperors, his story ended quietly, forgotten in obscurity. The irony is that his youth and weakness gave him a lasting name in history books. But behind the legend is just a boy, caught in the final act of a collapsing empire, forgotten not by name, but by his true story. Odoacer himself wasn't technically an emperor, but his rise marks the end of the Western Roman Empire. A Germanic general, he deposed Romulus Augustulus and declared himself king of Italy. To the people of Rome, this was both shocking and oddly anticlimactic. The NPR hadn't been Rome's for a long time. Odoacer's reign symbolized the transition from Roman to medieval Europe. He is often sidelined in history because he didn't wear the imperial purple. But in many ways, his act of deposition made him as important as any emperor, forgotten as a king, yet central to Rome's final bow. Zeno, ruling in the East, inherited an empire deeply fractured by politics, religion, and barbarian pressure. He managed to outlast revolts and betrayals, but his reign is overshadowed by more famous Eastern rulers. Zeno's dealings with Odoacer were crucial. He granted legitimacy to Odoacer's rule in Italy, while keeping Constantinople as the empire's beating heart. His reign shows that while the West crumbled, the East endured, adapting to survive. Forgotten in the shadow of Byzantine giants like Justinian, Zeno deserves more recognition for steering the empire through one of its most precarious transitions. Anastasius, another Eastern emperor, ruled with vision and reform. He reorganized finances, stabilized currency, and reduced corruption. His policies gave the Byzantine Empire a stronger foundation, proving that even in the wake of collapse, Rome's eastern half could thrive. Yet Anastasius is rarely mentioned outside scholarly works, overshadowed by emperors who waged wars or built monuments. His reign was quieter, defined by paperwork instead of battles. But sometimes, saving an empire isn't about swords or legions, it's about taxes and discipline. Forgotten because he lacked drama, Anastasius was exactly the kind of leader Rome desperately needed in its final centuries. Phocas, centuries later, came to power in a bloody coup that shocked Constantinople. He was a brutal and unpopular ruler, remembered mostly for executions and tyranny. His reign is often dismissed as one of the darkest periods of Byzantine history, but Phocas's story highlights the fragility of power in the Eastern Empire. how quickly a man could rise and fall, overthrown by Heraclius. His name became synonymous with failure, forgotten because no one wanted to remember him. Phogus is proof that not all emperors are remembered for glory. Some are remembered only for how badly they fell. Heraclius is better known, but often reduced to just one thing. He fought against the Persians and later saw the rise of Islam. But his reign was far more complex. He reorganized the empire, introduced new military systems, and kept Byzantium alive during existential crises. Yet, because the Arab conquests began during his final years, his achievements are overshadowed. Heraclius stands on the line between two worlds, the ancient empire of Rome and the medieval empire of Byzantium, forgotten in popular memory. His reign is one of transformation and tragedy. His resilience deserves more attention than the defeats that followed him. Constans II, another emperor often overlooked, tried to defend the empire against constant invasions. His reign saw the empire shrink, but also adapt, known for moving the imperial court temporarily to Syracuse and Sicily. Constans shocked contemporaries by abandoning Constantinople for a time. His assassination in a bathhouse shows the constant danger emperors lived under, forgotten because he left little monumental legacy. Constans II was still important in keeping the empire alive through sheer persistence. His reign reminds us that survival, not glory, was sometimes the best an emperor could achieve. Constantine V, centuries after Rome's traditional fall, became one of Byzantium's most controversial emperors, fierce in battle and ruthless in policy. He was a skilled general but infamous for persecuting icons and their supporters. His reign is often painted negatively by hostile chroniclers, but archaeology and military records suggest he was far more effective than his reputation implies. Forgotten outside academic debate, Constantine V shows how emperors could be both admired and despised, remembered and erased depending on who wrote the history. His story is a reminder that memory itself is political, and forgetting can be as powerful as remembering. Leo V, the Armenian, walked a razor's edge between battlefield urgency and theological fire. He clawed back discipline after years of drift, negotiated with the Bulgars when it bought time, and stiffened Constantinople's defenses when steel was required. Yet his answer to anxiety was a hard reset of iconoclasm, reopening old wounds over holy images. Admirals and bishops lined up on opposite shores of that argument, and Leo tried to captain both storms at once. He could be capable, even calm, in crisis but rigid. When compromise might have cooled the temperature, in December 820, enemies found him at prayer in Hagia Sophia. The ambush turned the sanctuary into a killing floor. The imitating emperor died beneath glittering mosaics, a final irony for a ruler obsessed with what could or could not be painted. History rarely lingers on Leo V. Too doctrinal for romantics, too political for saints, too brief for epics, but his reign shows how the crown in Byzantium was as perilous as any frontier one misstep in scripture or strategy, and even Christmas could become a battlefield. Michael the Amorian arrived as a soldier with suit on his hands and a rebellion at his door. He took the throne in the bloody wake of Leo V's murder, then immediately faced Thomas the Slavon insurgent general, who rallied cities, fleets, and foreign allies. Michael wasn't dazzling. He was stubborn. He held the straits, kept the treasury from bleeding out, and let methodical generals grind Thomas down. In faith, he chose caution over zeal, seeking a truce in the image wars to stop the empire from tearing itself apart. Court poets wouldn't call him glorious. Merchants, farmers, and shipwrights might call him useful. He kept the lights on, paid the crews, and left a dynasty that could plan beyond the next siege. That quiet competence is why he fades from popular memory. No grand conquest, no jeweled legend, only survival writ in ledgers and garrison rosters. Yet in an era when crowns shattered like amphyri, Michael II did the unromantic miracle. He kept the vessel whole, patched, seaworthy, and pointing toward calmer water for his son. Thaphilos, heir to the Amorian steadiness, dreamed in gold tessarian star charts. He loved engines, courtyards, and the gleam of new mosaics, almost as much as the roll of drums before a march. He paraded automata in palaces and tried to script Byzantium's image as a realm of brilliance art. Married to order. On campaign, he could be bold, even brilliant, But the eastern frontier bit back. The sack of Amoriema, wound to pride and birthplace, shadowed his victories like a storm cloud that refuses to break. Still, he rebuilt, reformed pay, patronized scholars, and left Constantinople looking more imperial than when he found it. Theophilos is often framed as a cultured loser, which is lazy shorthand. He was a builder under bombardment, a patron of beauty while counting arrows. Not every emperor can redraw the map. Some redraw the capital, so a future can exist. When the chronicles skim past his name, they skip the scaffolding. He raised proof that splendor is not vanity when splendor steadies hearts. Michael III enters the stage in hostile ink as the drunkard, a slur sharpened by the man who replaced him. The caricature is convenient. A careless youth, saved only by sober ministers. But beneath the slander lies a different outlined administrative consolidation, naval revival, and the famed victory of Petronius over Arab forces at Lalakean. Under Michael, the Frutian controversy crackled, diplomacy flexed, and the emperor's pulse steadied. Was he reckless? Sometimes. Was he idle? The record says no core life in Constantinople could be as done and lethal. Basel, the talented court favorite who owed Michael everything, became his assassin and successor. Propaganda did the rest, laundering murder into moral lesson. What survives of Michael's real reign shows a government climbing out of turbulence, not tumbling in. His tragedy is common to forgotten emperors. A hostile biographer with an army. Strip away the slogans and you find a ruler who, for all his flaws, helped pivot Byzantium from crisis to ward. Momentum until momenta shoved him into the dark. Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty, is the empire's great bootstrap myth. Stable boy turned stable state. He hunted opportunity with the patience of a falconer, mastering court ritual, law, and the dangerous art of smiling while calculating. After seizing the diadem over Michael's body, he governed like a contractor repairing cracked foundations. Administration tightened, coinage studied, and the legal colossus later called the Basilica began to take form. Churches, Rosa the Nea glittered. Basil lacked the lyricism of conquerors, but he had the cadence of longevity. He made institutions hum. His death tangled with a stag, memorialized in grim anecdote, gave poets an ending, but not a measure. The measure is this. The house he mortared stood for generations, sheltering scholars, generals, and the silk of a high Byzantine century. If legend makes him a usurper sainted by success, history makes him something rarer. Practical visionary who traded one life for a longer arc. Empires remember fireworks. They live on ballast. Basil was ballast. Leo V the Wise preferred pens to pikes. But he didn't live in a world that let pens rest. He codified sprawling law into cleaner lines, wrote sermons and statecraft, and argued with heaven about marriage when grief and dynastic need tangled him in a fourth union. Navy setbacks and a brutal Bulgarian rival, Simeon, bruised his military ledger. Chancery triumphs fattened his legal one. People love simple verdicts. Was he moral? Was he strong? Leo's reign resists that binary. He was an emperor for the long problems. Procedure, precedent, the grammar of governance. When storms hit, his fleets sometimes sank. When dawn returned, his statutes still stood. Those volumes would guide courts and councils long after spear points rusted. The Weiss isn't a compliment for an ivory tower. It's a citation for useful thought under pressure. If bods overlook him, jurists don't. In a civilization that prized ceremony, Leo understood that ceremony without rules is theater, and empires built on theater and at intermission. Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, war ink, like armor, born in the purple, sidelined by in-laws. Then restored, he answered the uncertainty of power with manuals how to run ceremonies, manage frontiers, read peoples beyond the sea. The ceremonias, choreographed. Legitimacy, de administrando. Imperio whispered field notes to successors. He trusted pens to tame centuries. If future emperors could learn from distilled experience, maybe the empire could cheat fate. Constantine was no lion of the frontier. And ignawit, he let the military aristocracy swing the sword while he mapped the mind of rule. That choice gets him filed under scholar, not sovereign, which misses the point. Byzantine strength was choreography as much as charged the dance of taxes, titles, treaties, and theater. Constantine tuned the music so others could march, forgotten by audiences craving battlefield fireworks. He remains essential reading in the back office of empire. Sometimes the bravest act is to admit you are a librarian in a world that worships generals and save the library anyway. Romanos I, Lekapanos, boarded the ship of state as an admiral, and moored by marrying his daughter to Constantine VII. And quietly steering his coup, he saw a danger others ignored. Great estates swallowing peasant soldiers, hollowing the army. His land laws clipped the wings of magnates, protecting smallholders who filled the ranks. He fortified the treasury, powdered the wheels of administration, and let competent captains win banners on the frontier. Romanos wasn't beloved. Reformers rarely are. His sons, hungry for undiluted glory, dumped him into monastic exile. Proof that Palestagars pierce policies is alias flesh. Yet Muchov, the Macedonian Renaissance, breathes his oxygen. Steadier budgets, stronger recruitment, a crown that remembered villages are as strategic as fortresses. Romanos disappears in popular tellings because he shared thrones and wrote few letters. But he played the long game, saving capacity over headlines. The empire he left was less brittle than the one he found, and that, in Byzantium, was a kind of quiet conquest. Like Theros strode from the frontier like a shard of iron ascetic. Relentless, terrifying in mail, he broke Crete's pirate stronghold, pushed into Cilicia and northern Syria, and turned terror outward after years of absorbing it. 2 monks. He seemed a saint in armor. 2 courtiers. A winter that never thawed. He slashed Privlius, pinched luxuries, and demanded that victory taste like fasting. The palace hated him for it, and love abandoned him at home. His wife Theophano and the glittering general John Simisks engineered a moonlit bedroom coup. The conqueror of citadels fell to a lech and a blade. Like Pharos is remembered by specialists as a hammer of Rome reborn, but his public memory blurs, lacking the romance of an Alexander, perhaps because his heroism was severe, not sweet, disciplined, not dazzling. He reminds us that security can be purchased by sacrifices. No festival will sing about tent that a bedroom door is sometimes a stronger wall than any city's. Jumpri Meratis, Emisks, the elegant swordsmen who followed, clothed conquest and charm. Ipused Rus armies back from the Balkans, pressed Armenia into firmer orbit, and wrote diplomacy as gracefully as he wrote campaigns. Where Nikephoros was granite, John was polished, still supple. Deadly, reflective, he soothed to the capital, curbed excess, and made victory look effortless, which is the hardest trick. Then, at the height of momentum, he died. Subtly poison is the rumor, brevity, the fact, without scandals to stain him or decades to define him. He slips from popular shelves, yet his reign is a bright thread in Byzantium's tapestry. Proof that the empire could still project power far from its domes. That velvet in armor need not quarrel. Forgotten fits only because memory is a marketplace with limited stalls. If you need one line to keep him, keep this. John Simisks showed how to win like a gentleman and govern like a grown-up. 2 arts history rarely grants the same man. Basil Segundo, later crowned the Bogar Slayer, is ironically too famous for one headline and too neglected for the breadth of his reign. The man ruled for almost 5 decades, yet memory often flattens him into a single gruesome victory. In reality, he was a workhorse temporarily distracted by pageantry, relentlessly focused on keeping aristocrats in check and filling the war chest. His campaigns reshaped the Balkans, yes, but his fiscal discipline also gave Byzantium the stamina to thrive after his death. He despised flattery, lived frugally, and slept closer to a soldier's cot than to a monarch's couch. His forgotten side is the bureaucrat, the detail fixer, The man who understood that an empire outlives its battles only if its books balance. That pragmatic devotion doesn't produce glamorous anecdotes, so popular history rarely lingers on him. But if longevity and stability are the true tests of rulership, Basil II's reign was a quiet triumph disguised as brutality. He reminds us that efficiency can be more radical than charisma, and that sometimes the strongest emperors are those who leave no golden statues only. A system sturdy enough to survive the next century's chaos. Constantine VIII lived in Basil's long shadow, inheriting power without the same appetite for grind. Where Basil ruled like a tireless clerk of destiny, Constantine tasted the throne like a rich dessert pleasant. But without discipline, he allowed aristocrats to stretch again, let some structure sag, and pursued pleasures more than policies. His reign wasn't catastrophic. The machinery Basil built could coast for a while, but Constantine's name blends into the haze of Porpidocanity, who wore the purple without reshaping it. In Chronicles, he is a placeholder, a reminder that longevity in office doesn't equal legacy in history, forgotten not because he failed spectacularly, but because he failed quietly. Empires need continuity, but continuity without vision breeds erosion. Constantine VIII shows how quickly momentum can fade when stewardship is treated as inheritance, not responsibility. His reign is a cautionary footnote. A state can endure on autopilot, but only until the turbulence arrives. Romano's 3 Argyros strutted into office with pomp. A rich noble convinced he could script his own legend, he spent lavishly on churches, staged ceremonial splendor, and imagined himself as a second Justinian. But visions without logistics crumble. His military adventures ended in embarrassment. His financial management bled silver, and his court became a theater of intrigue. Romanos is remembered less for his policies than for his deaths drowned, poisoned, or simply undone by palace plots. The ambiguity of his end mirrors the ambiguity of his reign. Ambition without achievement, ceremony without substance, forgotten not because he lacked drama, but because his drama produced no enduring reform. He is a case study in the gap between image and action. A reminder that empire isn't a stage play you can improvise into greatness. History leaves him in the margins because the margins are where unrealized dreams go to fade. Michael IV, the Paphlagonian, entered the palace as a guard, then rose through Theodora's marriage to Zoe, one of Byzantium's empresses of intrigue. He brought with him loyalty, humility, an epilepsy, a condition that shadowed his life. Surprisingly, he proved capable, repairing coinage and winning victories abroad. His campaigns in Sicily and against Bulgars were not trivial, but his illness wore him down, and he relied heavily on his brother John the Orphanatrophos, creating the perception that he was a puppet. Ill health led him into monastic retreat, where the forgotten emperors often share this fate. Competence dimmed by circumstance, good intentions swallowed by frailty. Michael IV reminds us that rulers are human first, monarchs second. His reign matters not for its fireworks, but for the way it showed an empire that even emperors could falter, yet governance could continue. Delegated and diluted in the machine of state, Michael V, the conqueror, burned bright and brief. Raised from humble origins, adopted by Zoe, he entered the purple with gratitude. But power intoxicates fast. Within months, exhaled soy, sparking riots that filled Constantinople's streets with fury. The mob demanded her restoration, and Michael fled to a monastery, blinded and broken, a one-year emperor. His reign is remembered as scandal, not substance. Forgotten emperors like Michael V occupy the space between tragedy and comedy. Rulers whose mistakes were so swift they leave no policy footprint, only gossip. But in their brevity lies a lesson. Michael V shows how fragile legitimacy was in Byzantium, how even a conqueror could patch his way to power, but failed to patch his relationship with the people. Forgotten not for lack of color, but for lack of his story is a cautionary parable. The purple could elevate, but it could also suffocate. In a single season, Constantine Ix Menemechos reigned with elegance, but little control. He loved culture, endowed monasteries, and opened the palace to intellectual ferment, but he also spent heavily, tolerated corruption, and allowed the military to atrophy. His reign is remembered for courtly brilliance, and geopolitical cracks, the loss of Armenia. The growing menace of Constantine appears in anecdotes as charming, indulgent, and charismatic. Yet policy faltered under a smile. He embodies the paradox of Byzantine decline. A capital shining in scholarship while its provinces slipped away. Forgotten emperors often preside over transitions. And Constantine IX was exactly that, a man too cultured for crisis, too charming for discipline. History writes him in italics, not bold. He shows that not all decline comes from catastrophe. Sometimes it flows from comfort, from leaders who mistake elegance for stability. His reign teaches that beauty without backbone leaves empires vulnerable to storms just beyond the horizon. Theodora, last of the Macedonian line, ruled alone in her final years, resisting those who thought a woman unfit for the diadem. She was sharp, uncompromising, and politically astute, maintaining control over appointments and resisting aristocratic encroachment. Yet her reign was short, and her death ended a dynasty that had steered Byzantium for nearly 2 centuries. She is often overshadowed by her earlier role as Zoe's sister or as a co-ruler in palace intrigues, rather than remembered as an independent sovereign, forgotten not because she lacked significance, but because she was inconvenient to later chroniclers, who preferred male-centered narratives. Theodora's reign proves that stability is not gendered, and her story illustrates how memory can be sculpted by bias, as much as by achievement. In an empire built on ceremony and succession, Theodora dared to close a chapter on her own terms. Her name deserves more than a footnote. It deserves recognition as the closer of a dynasty that defined a golden age. Michael VI, the old, shuffled into power as a stopgap. A bureaucrat elevated when the empire needed a placeholder. He relied heavily on court officials, alienated the military, and was quickly swept aside by Isaac Comnene. Forgotten emperors like Michael VI represent the thin crusts between real rulers, men who warm the throne but don't shape it. His brief reign shows how volatile succession could be, how emperors were sometimes chosen not for strength but for convenience. He reminds us that Byzantium's continuity often rested on fragile compromises, and that even a short reign could destabilize the balance between court and army. Forgotten not because he did nothing, but because his actions evaporated the moment he left the stage. In the grand performance of empire, Michael VI was the interlude necessary, forgettable, and quickly drowned out by the main act that followed. Isaac, Icomenos, soldier turned emperor, stormed onto the throne with promises of reform. He cut expenses, clipped aristocrats, and tried to restore fiscal discipline. His reign was brief, undone by illness, but it paved the way for the Comnenian dynasty. Isaac is remembered as a precursor rather than a protagonist, a man who lit a torch others would carry further. Forgotten emperors like Isaac are transitional figures, remembered more for the family name they launched than for their own deeds. Yet his reign matters because it shows that empires are not just shaped by long rulers, but also by those who reset. Isaac Comnene reminds us that even short reigns can be decisive, even if history forgets to man while celebrating the dynasty. Forgotten not because he lacked significance, but because his significance was absorbed by those who followed. Constantine Exducus, came to power as a civilian emperor, scholarly and cautious, more at home in philosophy than on the battlefield. He cut military spending, favoring bureaucracy and aristocracy, which seemed reasonable in peacetime but disastrous when enemies pressed on the borders. His reign marks a turning point. The professional army weakened, leaving Byzantium vulnerable to the Seljuk advance. Constantine is often remembered as the emperor who led the empire as a shield rust, though in fairness, he inherited structural strains. Forgotten emperors like him show how small decisions ripple into catastrophe later. By privileging scholars and bureaucrats over soldiers, he changed the empire's balance. His reign wasn't a spectacle of collapse, but the quiet withdrawal from strength that set up later defeats. History rarely forgives such choices. He becomes a lesson in misplaced priorities, proof that vision without defense is as dangerous as defense without vision. His place is not in the gallery of villains, but in the shadowed hallway of well-meaning rulers, whose caution turned corrosive. Eudokia, Macrombolitisa, Constantine's widow, stepped in as regent, holding power in a court that often resisted women in authority. She was intelligent, capable, and politically savvy. Balancing aristocratic factions while raising her sons, she later married Romanos for Diogenes, a military man. In an effort to strengthen the empire's defenses, Eudokia's reign as empress is often overlooked because she governed in a transitional role. Yet her choices shaped the empire's direction, forgotten not because she lacked importance, but because later chroniclers minimized women's authority. Framing her more as a widow than as a sovereign, her story illustrates how power could be wielded in unconventional ways, how women could step into the vacuum of succession, and how memory often erases that nuance. Eudokia reminds us that forgotten emperors include forgotten empresses, sidelined not by insignificance, but by bias. She was a political chess player in an era when the board was stacked against her. Romanos for Diogenes entered history with the energy of a general determined to restore military might. He rebuilt forces, launched campaigns against the Seljuks, and staked his reign on victory. That gamble culminated at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, one of Byzantium's greatest defeats. Romanos was captured, humiliated, and eventually blinded after losing the throne. His story is remembered as tragedy, but his actual reign was more complex. He was one of the few who saw the danger clearly and acted decisively. But fate and betrayal doomed him. Forgotten emperors like Romanos show how history can reduce a reign to a single catastrophe. His efforts to restore military vigor, his reforms, and his courage are overshadowed by the disaster it meant. He is remembered not as the man who tried to save Byzantium, but as the man under whom it nearly crumbled. Memory can be cruel, flattening a life of ambition into one battlefield defeat. Michael Septimo Doukas, nicknamed Peripenax, for devaluing coinage so badly it bought only a fraction of its old worth, symbolizes fiscal mismanagement. He loved books, poetry, and philosophy, but left governance to others. His reign saw economic decline, military failures, and the loss of Byzantine prestige. He abdicated and retired to monastic life, leaving behind a reputation as weak and ineffectual. Forgotten emperors like Michael VII become punchlines. His nickname survives longer than his policies, but behind the caricature lies the deeper truth. Intellectual passion does not substitute for political acumen. Michael VII embodies the gap between scholar and sovereign, reminding us that ruling requires more than literacy in books. It requires literacy in power. His reign is remembered with a smirk, yet his story warns that when emperors retreat into comfort, the empire pays the cost. His poetry may have been beautiful, but the empire needed steel, not stanzas. Nikephoros III Botaniates ascended the throne as an elderly general, ruling in a time of deep crisis. He promised stability, but delivered little, relying on court favorites and watching provinces drift away. His advanced age and limited vigor made him more of a caretaker than a reformer. His reign, filled with revolts and internal strife, ended quietly when Alexios Komnenos seized power. Nikephoros is forgotten because he neither collapsed dramatically nor triumphed decisively. He represents the twilight of an old guard, the moment before fresh energy arrived with the Komnenian dynasty. Forgotten emperors like him are placeholders, bridges between eras. His story is a reminder that sometimes history requires transition figures, letters whose reigns exist mainly to clear the stage for those who follow. Nikephoros III reminds us that not all rulers are meant to shine. Some are meant to fade, so that others may blaze. Alexios I Komnenos was anything but forgettable, yet he is often overshadowed by the First Crusade, which erupted during his reign. He rebuilt the empire's fortunes, reorganized its army, and restored some measure of stability after decades of decline. Yet popular memory focuses on the Crusaders, painting Alexios as a side character in their story. Forgotten emperors can even be strong ones, diminished not by weakness, but by the narratives written by others. Alexios deserves recognition for saving Byzantium from collapse, for re-establishing order and military credibility, but Western chronicles remember him through Crusader eyes, often as a manipulator or His true legacy is that of a restorer, a pragmatist, who played survival chess with both Seljuks and Crusaders. Alexios shows how emperors can be both remembered and forgotten, lionized in one tradition, minimized in another. Memory, like empire, is contested territory. John II Comneno, son of Alexios, ruled quietly but effectively, strengthening defenses, reforming finances, and waging steady campaigns. He lacked his father's charisma, but exceeded him in discipline. Chroniclers often describe him as modest, almost plain, a ruler more interested in function than in flair. Forgotten emperors like John II proved that substance can outshine spectacle, yet history often remembers spectacle more. His reign was stable, prosperous, and militarily competent, laying the groundwork for his successors. But because he lacked the dramatic flair of his father or son, his name fades. He reminds us that good governance is not always loud, and that sometimes the emperors who leave their people most secure are the ones history whispers about least. John II's reign is a paradox. Forgettable in drama, unforgettable in consequence. His empire stood taller after him, though his own shadow was small. Menwu I Komnenos revived Byzantine glory with charisma, ambition, and flair for Western-style chivalry. He engaged with crusader states, forged alliances, and sought to position Byzantium as a Mediterranean superpower. But his wars drained resources, and his policies left successors overextended. Manuel is often remembered in flashes of brilliance's jousts, his diplomacy, his daring campaigns, but forgotten for the strategic overreach that followed. Forgotten emperors include those whose light dazzled too brightly, burning out the empire's reserves. Manuel embodies the paradox of brilliance without balance, a ruler too bold for Byzantium's fragile reality. His reign reminds us that sometimes strength accelerates decline, that grandeur without grounding can leave an empire brittle. Manuel was no mere footnote, but history forgets his cautionary lessons, remembering only his theater of greatness. His legacy, like his jousts, was exhilarating but unsustainable, leaving Byzantium vulnerable to storms it could not withstand. Alexios II Komnenos was a boy when he inherited the throne, more pawn than player. His reign was dominated by regents, court factions, and eventually the usurpation by Andronikos. The first forgotten emperors like Alexios II remind us of how fragile childhood monarchies could be, how dynasties sometimes gambled on heirs too young to rule. His reign produced little policy, little agency, and ended violently. Forgotten not because he lacked importance, but because he never had the chance to act. He is a symbol of what happens when empire becomes inheritance rather than responsibility. His name lives in the list of emperors, but not in the list of shapers. Alexios' story is a reminder of how history can swallow the young whole, leaving their reigns as shadows rather than monuments. Andronikos, the first Komnenos, stormed into power with promises of reform, charisma, and vengeance against corrupt elites. For a time, he seemed like a savior, cutting privileges and disciplining nobles. But his cruelty grew, and his paranoia consumed him. His reign ended in a violent uprising, his body torn by a mob. Andronikos is remembered as both reformer and tyrant, but often forgotten in the broader sweep, because his reign ended in horror. Forgotten emperors like him illustrate how excess drowns reform. His story warns that charisma without restraint curdles into terror, and that empires tire quickly of saviors who turn executioner. He is remembered as a cautionary tale, that reform through fear builds nothing but enemies, and that memory punishes cruelty by consigning it to obscurity. Isaac II Angelos, Rose, in turbulent times, hailed as a liberator when he overthrew Andronikos I. At first, he inspired hope, restoring some measure of justice and favor with the people. But soon, his reign unraveled under corruption, heavy taxation, and poor leadership. He relied too much on favorites, ignored the army, and left the empire exposed. Forgotten emperors like Isaac II remind us that revolutions can devour themselves when the new ruler fails to deliver. His reign ended in disgrace. Deposed by his own brother, he became a symbol of squandered opportunity, remembered more for his downfall than his promises. Isaac II's story lingers, not in triumphs, but in the warning that charisma without competence collapses quickly. Alexios III Angelos usurped his brother Isaac, and his reign was even worse. He drained the treasury, neglected the army, and indulged in luxury while enemies pressed harder. The empire's defenses crumbled, and his cowardice was legendary. He fled Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, leaving the city to its fate. Forgotten emperors like Alexios III embody decline at its starkest. Rulers who abandon their capital when the storm comes. He was remembered as the emperor who sold Byzantium's dignity for comfort. His reign is a reminder that neglect is as destructive as hostility, that indifference can kill an empire as surely as conquest. History judges harshly when leaders run instead of resist. Alexios Kwartankelos, son of Isaac II, was installed by crusaders after they captured Constantinople. He promised wealth and favors to the West, but couldn't deliver, bankrupting the empire further and angering the people. His dependence on foreigners made him seem a puppet, not a sovereign. His reign ended violently when he was deposed and executed. Forgotten emperors like Alexios IV illustrate the danger of external dependency, of leaders who mortgage sovereignty for survival. He is remembered not for his acts, but for the humiliation of being a crusader's pawn. His story shows that legitimacy evaporates when rulers are seen as serving others, not their own people. Alexios Kintaduka, nicknamed Mortsouphlis, came to power in desperation as crusaders loomed. He attempted to fortify Constantinople, showing more energy than his predecessors, but when the city fell in 1204, his reign collapsed too, captured and executed by the crusaders. His story is one of brief defiance against overwhelming odds. Forgotten emperors like Alexios IV, overshadowed by the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade, their efforts buried beneath the larger disaster. He reminds us that even courage can be swallowed by collapse, that determination means little when an empire is already hollow. His reign was short but symbolized the last gasp of resistance before the Latin conquest. The Latin emperors who ruled Constantinople after 1204, like Baldwin I, are often treated as intruders rather than legitimate successors. Their reigns were fragile, propped up by crusader swords and Western allies. Baldwin himself was captured by Bulgarians, leaving the empire in chaos. Forgotten emperors like him straddled the line between conqueror and caretaker, remembered more as anomalies than as true rulers. The Latin Empire was a foreign body, grafted onto Byzantine soil, rejected by locals and despised by rivals. Baldwin's story is a reminder that legitimacy is as crucial as might. His empire existed on paper but not in hearts. Henry of Flanders, Baldwin's brother, ruled with more skill, stabilizing the Latin Empire temporarily. He made peace with Bulgarians, secured alliances, and showed competence rare among the Latin rulers. Yet his reign is little remembered, overshadowed by the empire's eventual collapse. Forgotten emperors like Henry remind us that even strong leadership cannot save a structure built on shaky foundations. His story is both hopeful and tragic, proof that leadership matters, but also that context limits even the most capable rulers. Henry ruled well, but he ruled an empire doomed from birth. His legacy fades because success without longevity often dissolves in memory. The restored Byzantine emperors after 1261, beginning with Michael VIII Palaiologos, inherited a battered empire. Michael VIII recaptured Constantinople, celebrated as a savior, yet he compromised sovereignty by making unpopular deals with the West, sparking internal dissent. Forgotten emperors like him remind us that even triumphs can carry heavy costs. He is remembered for the restoration, but his concessions planted seeds of resentment. His reign illustrates the tension between survival and sovereignty, between keeping the empire alive and keeping it free. History sometimes crowns liberators with mixed laurels, their victories tarnished by the compromises needed to achieve them. Andronikos, the second Palaiologos, reigned for decades, but oversaw gradual decline. He dismantled the navy to save costs, relied heavily on mercenaries, and faced constant revolts. His reign lacked dramatic collapse but slowly eroded the empire's capacity to defend itself. Forgotten emperors like Andronikos II represent the slow bleed rather than the sudden fall. His decisions reflect pragmatism that turned poisonous, austerity that hollowed defenses. His long rule teaches that longevity is not always a blessing. Sometimes it means presiding over prolonged decay. Memory forgets rulers like him not out of malice, but because decline stretched too long to leave one dramatic moment. Andronikos III Palaiologos, his grandson, revived energy with campaigns and reforms. Restoring some hope, he pushed against the Ottomans, reasserted imperial control, and brought flashes of vigor back to Byzantium, yet his reign is overshadowed by what followed. As civil wars after his death tore apart the gains he made, forgotten emperors like Andronikos III illustrate how timing shapes legacy. His efforts mattered, but succession disputes buried them. His reign shows how even capable rulers cannot secure memory if their successors undo their work. He is remembered faintly, a burst of energy in a fading empire. John V Palaiologos ruled in an era when the empire was little more than a city-state, dependent on Western aid. He spent much of his reign negotiating, pleading, and compromising with foreign powers. His reign symbolizes survival at any cost, but history remembers him as weak. Forgotten emperors like John V embody the humiliation of Byzantium's last century sovereigns in name. Subjects in practice, his legacy is overlooked because it was one of concessions, not victories. It ruled long but left little mark beyond showing how far Byzantium had fallen. Memory favors builders, not survivors. And John V was only the latter. Manuel II Palaiologos ruled in the twilight of Byzantium. A scholar and diplomat more than a warrior, he traveled through Western Europe, pleading for aid against the Ottomans, even writing theological works while his empire crumbled. Forgotten emperors, like Manuel II, remind us that intelligence and eloquence are not always enough to save a state. He was respected abroad but powerless at home. His reign symbolizes the paradox of brilliance without power. An emperor remembered more for words than deeds. His story shows the tragedy of being wise in an age that demanded armies, not arguments. John VIII Palaiologos, his son, inherited the same impossible situation. He agreed to union with the Catholic Church in hopes of gaining military aid. But this decision alienated many of his subjects. He's remembered not for victories, but for desperate diplomacy. Forgotten emperors like John VIII embody the cruel bind of survival politics. Compromise abroad, rejection at home. His reign was one of endless negotiation, a reminder that sometimes rulers are trapped between impossible choices. His legacy faded because neither side fully embraced him, leaving him stranded in memory as a man caught between worlds. Konstantinos Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, is not forgotten, but myth. Yet in his shadow stand emperors like John VII or lesser co-regents, whose short reigns blur into obscurity. Constantine's dramatic death, defending Constantinople, overshadows the quieter rulers before him. Forgotten emperors in this era are casualties of narrative eclipsed by the final, heroic ending. Their contributions vanish because history loves a climax. These rulers remind us that memory is selective, honoring martyrs while ignoring administrators. The last centuries of Byzantium are full of shadows, where some emperors never step into the light. Beyond Byzantium, forgotten emperors exist in the Western Roman Empire's collapse. Figures like Honorius, who reigned during the sack of Rome in 410, are mocked for incompetence. He cared more for his chickens and his capital. According to legend, forgotten emperors like him remind us that apathy can be fatal. He was emperor during one of Rome's darkest moments, yet his lack of action defined him. His reign illustrates how indifference writes its own obituary. Rome survived, but his memory did not. Fading into ridicule, his story shows how mockery can erase dignity faster than defeat. Valentine III ruled in the empire's final years in the West. A child emperor overshadowed by generals and advisors, he presided over decline without shaping it. Remembered mostly for being powerless in his own court, forgotten emperors like Valentine are not condemned, but pit. His story reflects how youth and weakness are swallowed by history's momentum. He ruled but never governed, carried along by tides he could not control. His reign warns that crowns do not equal power, and that rulers without agency leave only faint echoes. His life was tragic, a reminder of how fragility hastens collapse. Petronius Maximus briefly claimed the throne in 455, but ruled for only a few months before being killed during chaos. His reign was so short that many forget he even existed. Forgotten emperors like Maximus embody the ephemerality of power, how legitimacy can vanish overnight. His story is less about governance and more about the dangers of ambition in unstable times. He tried to grasp power but had no support, no foundation. History erased him quickly, and rightly so. for his reign was barely a flicker. His fate shows how instability devours opportunists first. Avitus, installed by the Visigoths as emperor, ruled briefly in the west. His reliance on barbarian support made him unpopular with Romans, and his reign ended in disgrace. Forgotten emperors like Avitus represent the emperor's loss of autonomy. When outsiders shape leadership more than Romans themselves, his story reflects how foreign influence undermined legitimacy. He ruled, but not with respect. History forgets rulers who are seen as puppets, for they never truly held the throne. Avitus is remembered faintly, an echo of the empire's fragmentation, a warning of what happens when sovereignty becomes a bargaining chip. Majorian, however, deserves better memory. He fought to restore the empire, reform its administration, and resist barbarian advances. Yet his reign was cut short when he was deposed and executed by his own general. Forgotten emperors like Majorian show how even genuine reformers can be erased if they lack stable support. His efforts mattered, but they were unfinished, leaving history to overlook him. He is a what-if emperor, a figure whose legacy is lost, not because of failure, but because of brevity. His reign reminds us that success needs time, and he never had enough. Libius Severus followed Majorian, but was a puppet ruler, installed by the powerful general Risp. He had no authority and little impact, fading quickly into obscurity. Forgotten emperors like Severus illustrate how power behind the throne eclipses the figure on it. He is remembered not for acts, but for absence. His reign symbolizes emptiness, a reminder that rulers without autonomy vanish from memory. History cares for actors, not spectators, and Severus was little more than a prop. His story warns of the futility of wearing a crown when others hold the reins. Antimus, sent from the Eastern Empire to stabilize the West, tried valiantly to resist the Vandals. He worked for alliances and reforms, but was killed in civil conflict. Forgotten emperors like Anthemius are casualties of chaos-capable leaders who never had the chance to succeed. His reign shows that even skill cannot save a collapsing system. His memory fades because his efforts ended in failure. Despite promise, he represents the last attempts to keep the West afloat. History forgets him because collapse overshadowed everything else, erasing even competence in the roar of defeat.